Good day, colleagues. Welcome to the session today. This is one of our reflective sessions, or I should say bonjour, and I could probably greet you in all kinds of languages. We're connecting from all over the world. So for some of us, it's morning, some afternoon, some evening. Great to be back with you. We've got a special guest today that's going to be sharing with us. But before we get into an introduction of our special guest and into a conversation about using foresight in the context of systems change, I wanted to pause and reflect on the session you had on Monday with my colleague, Peter Glenday. I know that he was sharing with you on systems and systems thinking and the use of systems in foresight. Welcome, Fabio. What I'd like to invite you to do is in the chat, if you have any questions or take-ups, thoughts, what you found interesting, what you found challenging about Monday's session on the use of systems thinking within foresight, please pop that in the chat. One of the questions we often get is, how do you know when to stop doing systems thinking? Because of course, systems thinking can become quite complex and it can go into an unending level of complexity and expansion. And so the question I often get is, when do you stop? And how complex must the system be before you stop doing that analysis? And of course, the answer to that is it depends on what you're trying to do with the foresight. If you are doing foresight about a very large, what we would call a nested system or a panarchy, if you're doing foresight, for instance, on the future of a country, you might be thinking about the political system and the economic system and the social system and the ecological system around climate change. So you might develop a very sophisticated system with a very wide scope. But you can also use systems thinking in a very simple way to think about the relationship between 2 or 3 variables. And then you would be intentional about where the boundary is of that system that you develop. And so what are your questions or key observations coming out of Monday's session? I'm looking for any comments in the chat. I don't see any yet. Please share if you have any questions or comments in the chat. If you don't, you also welcome to put up a hand and unmute your mic. Maybe you want to pose a question or make a comment, anything out of the chat, out of the session from Monday. Chantal, thank you for that comment. So Chantal says, it feels more like an art than a science. So this is interesting, Chantal. If you put those two against each other, art versus science, what do you mean? Is it about creativity versus being quantitative and detailed and empirical, or is it about intuition versus analysis? What the word that we like to use in the School of International Futures is the word craft. You can craft, which is art, but there's also the science of how your paints create different colors and how different colors respond in different light and how certain lines in your artwork relate. And so foresight and systems thinking, which involves elements of science, rigorous thinking, repeatable experiments, the ability to disprove certain propositions or certain hypotheses, but it certainly can involve elements of art, creativity, thinking beyond that. And so thank you, Chantal, for putting in that word craft in the chat. Anyone else who has a thought coming out of Monday's session, maybe a broad reflection, what you found interesting or difficult, or a question? I don't see any hands going up. I'm taking it that you felt quite comfortable and inspired by the session. As you're thinking about that, let me remind you that there is a Q&A section in House Space, and we do monitor it. We've been answering your questions there, so you can use that as well. Maybe let me take these last couple before we come to our guest. Michael Lim, thank you for your comment, says, how do you, I would say, you probably say choose or use the number of drivers, right? How do you know the number of drivers? Well, the answer, Michael, is that there isn't a law that says you can only have 2 drivers or 3 drivers or 100 drivers. You would really use the drivers depending on the system you're trying to understand. And so if it's a complex system, it might, in other words, if it is a system that is going to be affected by other systems. So for instance, if you're looking at the public health of a country, the public health will also be affected by the economy. If people become more wealthy, they eat more processed food, they tend to, which means that they have more lifestyle diseases. So the health system is going to be affected by the economic system, which is going to be affected by the global trade system. So depending on the system you're looking at, you would look more widely for the kinds of drivers. And so you might have many drivers. However, it's not always helpful to have more drivers. Sometimes when you're doing systems thinking, it's more helpful to look at less drivers and really understand the way that those drivers interact, because the purpose is the insight. It's not about creating the right system. It's about creating useful, valuable insights when we're doing systems thinking. But it is an important question, and that's why it's more of a craft, right? You have to make judgments, and there's the word reduce. Thank you, Michael. You have to make judgments about that. Now, one other thing to say, now that I know that you're talking about reducing drivers, there are some drivers that have an effect in a small part of the system. So for instance, the cost of wheat might affect the cost of milk because it affects the cost of raising cattle. So there's a driver, right? Wheat, cattle, milk. There's a single relationship. But if you raise the interest rates in an economy, the interest rates would have multiple effects across the system. And so one of the ways of reducing the drivers is by looking at the fundamental underlying drivers that are going to have wide-ranging impacts across the system. And then we're really talking about drivers that are what we call leverage points. They have an impact on the system that is so profound, it can change the entire system's behavior. Now, we have an expert with us and a real user of systems and systems thinking. I'm going to introduce her in 1 second. Let me just touch on tomorrow's question. Drivers are also interconnected. It doesn't always easy to articulate them. Definitely systems analysis felt like a web analysis. Yes, you can think of it as a web analysis or an ecosystem analysis. The only thing I would add, Tamara, is we would be careful not to get stuck in the analysis, because analysis means that we can understand the system and can control the system to some degree. Sometimes systems are complex, which means that you can't easily analyze their outcomes. Their outcomes are emergent, which is part of what we're going to talk about today, which means their outcomes are unpredictable. And so really, we would be looking for the uncertainty in the system and doing foresight on the uncertainty rather than modeling the certainty, which is what systems analysts often like to do. They want to be certain, they want to model. And then lastly, Fabio, in a number of cases, a driver can be at the same time inhibitor and enabler. Am I supposed to consider both? This is such a great question. Very often, Fabio, systems become cyclical. They become cyclical internally with vicious cycles or virtuous cycles that are reinforcing, or they create cycles that are counteractive, that prevent the system from building momentum. And so what we do with drivers is we analyze at some points, this driver, like raising interest rates, might accelerate the inflation in an economy. It might mean that food becomes more expensive. But by raising interest rates, you're also raising the cost of capital, which decelerates the investment in the economy. So interest rates are both an enabler and a disabler of economic performance, of economic action. And many drivers are like that. They work in both directions, depending on where in the system we are looking at. Now, I'm happy to say that today we have a very special guest to spend some time with us. Tanja Hichert is a fellow South African. She works out of Stellenbosch. She's a very established professional futurist. She's worked all around the world in the private sector, working with the public sector, working with civil society as an academic at the university. She got her Master of Philosophy at Stellenbosch University, cum laude. She also worked with continues to work with the Center for Complex Systems in Transition at the University of Stellenbosch, and has worked with the Association of Professional Futurists, the South African node of the Millennial Project, and so really is a really experienced futurist, foresighter, using the paradigm or the mindset of systems thinking in her work, or systems generally in her work. So Tanja, welcome to the session today. I wonder if I could open up by saying, Share with us a little bit about your work and why you think systems are so important to foresight.
Thanks for having me, Marius, and hi to everybody. It's integral. It's not just important. And I want to take a slightly different tack at it. So not just in terms of a systems analysis, but to really emphasize what is key when doing any kind of foresight work. And it's because strategic foresight and futurist people they're big picture thinkers. And, if you're a big picture thinker and you kind of tackling challenges and problems from this sort of more big picture perspective, it means inherently that you've got to develop an understanding for the dynamic and the interdependencies and the sort of the complexities that are happening in this bigger picture that you're looking at, regardless of the more specific topic. So just because of the nature of the work, futures foresight people tend to have a systems perspective. And in that regard, systems thinking, actually even calling it a perspective underestimates its importance. I would argue it's a paradigm. So it's a way of completely thinking, understanding the world. And very often I like you talking about it's a lens that you use through looking at anything it is you want to look at. Systems thinking. So not just in terms of systems analysis and building a systems map of a specific system and seeing how many there are or not, but the actual systems thinking is a fundamental perspective of future studies and foresight. And that really boils down to the fact that one is able to get your head around and then to work, craft. Complex adaptive systems, because nothing that we're looking at, we like to, at CST, Center for Complex Systems and Transition, we like to say that any system that's got a human being in it is a complex adaptive system. So any sort of linear, rational, mechanistic approach is immediately inadequate. So having that perspective and that paradigm, that mental model of what you're working with is complex. Small things can lead to big changes. The opposite happens as well. You can have really big, huge interventions. Marius, just think of the amount of money that South Africa is pouring into its education system and nothing changes, because that system has got an interrelatedness and an interconnectedness and a history, and it has a future that is built in and constantly feedback looping, reinforcing itself. And if you, as a futures foresight person, start working in a systematic way, using the future with the tools and the methodologies that you have got to have a very strong systems thinking kind of underpinning approach to anything you want to do.
So Tanja, that's fascinating, and it's so relevant to the program, because of course this program is called Foresight for Systems Change. It's really a community of people across the UN system who recognize the need for systems change, both within the UN and through the UN in the wider world. And so that foresight paradigm, or that systems paradigm, becomes crucial. You mentioned the work you do with the Center for Systems, Complex Systems in Transition. Can you talk to us a little bit about what do you mean by a complex system in transition, and why is that important?
Sure. At its most basic level, Marius, it's all about change. Many people argue that change is happening faster than ever before. It's an arguable point. It's not necessarily the case, because that French saying, my French is not very good, but plus ça change, plus ça, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But essentially, if one starts looking at change, how it happens, and change is in a way sort of what creates the future. You've got to realize that it is systems that are changing. And I mean, very simplistically, we're in a transition. We're in an energy transition globally, and it's massive. It's come from a very long time. It's going into a very different future. If you just think this transition that we're going through in terms of fossil fuels to renewable energy, we're in a deep kind of values cultural change with regard to gender, with regard to identity. We're in massive sort of ecological change, ecosystem services, and even bumping it up a level further in terms of meta level change that's happening. We are busy exiting, we're transitioning the last 10,000 years of our geographic history on Earth as human beings. So, you know, we've had 10,000 years of a Goldilocks climate, not too hot, not too cold. It's very nice for human development, our development of agriculture, our development of cities, of literature, of our growth in numbers as human beings has all been shaped by this Holocene epoch. And we're transitioning out of that Holocene epoch and into something called the Anthropocene. And that Anthropocene, our new geological epoch, which is going to be the next thousands and thousands of years. And the geologists are very conservative scientists. They make sure that they're able to measure, that you're going to be able to see in the Earth's crust the new geological epoch. And they've agreed now on this. The Anthropocene is essentially this new epoch where human activity is fundamentally changing Earth systems. So that's at that meta level transition that we're busy going through. And underneath that, the same you were talking about, it depends what system you're looking at, the sort of the subsystems transitioning underneath that. And I guess it's interesting, you mentioned the word panarchy, Marius. I'm not sure how much theory people are doing about that, but what is fascinating is in these nested complex cycles that each system goes through, some of the smaller systems can actually put brakes onto a larger system until there's a tipping point, and then there's dramatic change. And you know, that starts taking, and of course, if a bigger system tips and changes, it affects absolutely everything. And that's kind of where we are now, is this transition into Anthropocene is going to change absolutely everything. And that's what makes Futures and Foresight so important, is because starting to, in a systematic way, explore the future and start looking, well, for how might it be? What might life look like, depending on where you are? And then it becomes contextual, of course, you know, and that's the other issue. So, system thinking is always contextual.
So Tanja, that's fascinating, and I love the way you describe the many systems within, you know, related to each other. And you mentioned a number of them, sort of in free flowing. There, you mentioned the sort of energy, industrial, techno system, the human demographic system, the cultural value system, and then rolled it up into the ecological system, reminding me of the book Donut Economics, which of course talks about the planetary boundaries of what we are doing economically on the Earth. Now, you've worked a little bit with a global project called The Seeds of the Good Anthropocene. In a minute, we're going to share some links to some resources about that. How can you talk to us about how foresight is being used, I guess, in a positive way, trying to think through what that Anthropocene may look like and how we can be intentional about ensuring that the outcomes are positive?
Yeah, I'm not so sure we can be intentional, Marius, but we can assure ourselves if we don't have some stories about how it could be okay. There's an enormous amount of, Johan, I'm going to specifically ask you to share a different link to the site before we share the one where the resources are, because there's a whole wodge of resources in there. And it's the whole bigger, larger project, whereas the foresight part of it is very much more specific. So Johan, I don't know whether Marius shared his link with you.
I've shared the other link. I'm sure
Yes, I've got that. I'll
share
put it in just now.
Brilliant. If you could put that one and just make a mention that it's easier to kind of go to that one first before doing the deeper dive into the larger project. It makes it more user-friendly. Marius, yeah, I mean, this is going, I don't know how much theory you cover, but I mean, this is going to Fred Pollack, who was a Dutch, he wouldn't have called himself a futurist at all. He was a socialist, sorry, a sociologist, I'm getting that, sociologist, after the Second World War in Europe. And of course, you know, Europe had been flattened by bombs all over. And he wrote this wonderful sort of book about images of the future, and saying that depending on what kind of stories you have, what images of the future you have, tends to shape the kind of decisions you make and actions you take. And he said, well, you know, if you have good stories and visions, that makes it more possible to have hopeful futures. And then that starts enabling you to start doing and thinking small things in the present that might eventually make it more likely that you start heading towards, or start making, in inverted commas, a more hopeful, positive future. So, you know, if everything, all our stories, and we're constantly surrounded by it, if all our stories are about doom and gloom and disaster, it doesn't give us much in terms of ways of thinking or tools to be able to help our decision making to really have some kind of influence, as you say. So the thinking behind this project in particular, and I'm glad you mentioned Kate Raworth's work on donut economics. And what's fascinating, this methodology that we developed for this project is now being taken up by Donut Economics Lab for building better futures. So Donut Economics Lab is actually using this. And then what they say is that within the planetary boundaries that kind of constrain all of human activity, we also need to develop, there's got to be some human development still. And human development here doesn't mean the sort of uber consumption that we have in the Western world. You know, there's more energy being used for air conditioning in North America than there is on the whole Africa continent. So, you know, we're not all going to have air conditioners at our beck and call, but we've got to have decent levels of human development, which is still very much lacking in certain parts of the world. And the question then is, how on earth do you go about that? And for that, we developed a futures thinking project where the key to all of it was to start looking, and there were a whole lot of very fancy academics working on this, started building a database of what we called seeds of good anthropocenes. So these seeds are essentially little pockets of the future in the present. So it could be anything. It could be small scale experiment. It could be projects or initiatives or even new ways of thinking that exist on the margin of the kind of world that we're entering into, because this world that we're entering into is these convergent cascading crises, you know, sort of climate change, biodiversity loss, breakdown of ecosystem services, this larger anthropocene thing, the whole limits to growth thing. So where are there little signs of social institutions or technology or frameworks of understanding the world that are not mainstream, but that have the potential or have shown at local scale to improve livelihoods and do a better job of sort of having sustainable outcomes, given the problems that we're in. So that was sort of the overarching objective of this work. Do you want me to take a sort of a little bit of a deeper dive?
So Tanja, I want to follow on there with a question, but before I pose the question, I want to read a comment by Nadia in the chat, because I think it links to the question I want to ask, which is about stories. So she says here in the chat, I think the modeling urge also comes from a pressure for our socialization audience. We want to socialize elements of our system thinking outputs to an audience which is often skeptical about the usability of results in programmatic context. We then find ourselves adapting our outputs, which are supposed to reflect complexity and uncertainty, and fitting them into existing schemes, which are governed by a need for modelization and the need to sustain this illusion of control over emergent elements of a system. So, Nadia, I want to give you 5 extra percentage points if you were writing an exam for that excellent thought, because it brings us to this question, Tanja. You mentioned stories and what I would call story fragments, or what you called seeds of the good anthropocene in the present. Now, when we do systems, very often the instinct is to be technocratic, technical minded, but at some level, stories are part of the system. I wonder if you want to reflect on that for a minute.
No, well, very much so. I mean, and Marius, I mean, the same with any kind of foresight work. It doesn't, I mean, you're not going to be a very good strategic foresight futures person if you just do a kind of a analysis of what's happening on the external. You've got to do that same kind of analysis in terms of what the language is being used, you know, what the internal, the world views. If you just think causal layered analysis, the deeply held myths and metaphors, and the extreme importance of those, and then of course the huge amount of leverage that there is, the possibility for change is massive if you're able to affect systems change at that deeper level. Did you do causal layered analysis with the participants yet?
I've just mentioned in the chat that next week, as part of scenarios, we'll be dealing with that.
Okay. Then in that case, just shortly to say, causal layered analysis is one of those sort of wonderful crossover systems and futures tools where we imagine an iceberg, and the tip of the iceberg sticking up above the water is the headlines. It's the litany, it's the things we see every day. But then as you deepen down and look at what's underneath, what causes those headlines, it's systems and patterns that cause the headlines. Underneath that, it's the worldviews and mental models that shape the patterns of behavior in the systems. And at the very deepest level, under the water, it's myths and metaphors and stories and deeply held beliefs. And that when you're able to start working with those and effecting change there, it can be extremely powerful. It's got a very high degree of leverage. If you look, if you think of Donella Meadows' work, places to intervene in a system, a paradigm shift, a mental model change is a hell of a lot more powerful in terms of affecting change than any kind of tinkering in terms of, changing bosses or roles or things like that. Just to swing back to the point that Nadia made, Nadia, I'm afraid that a lot of that is not going to change until there is some kind of systems change where bosses and senior people get rewarded and incentivized for understanding, accepting complexity, uncertainty, and changing sort of managerial behavior that's better suited to this VUCA world that we're operated in. And unfortunately, they're not. Enormous amount is still extremely short-term oriented, extremely quarterly results oriented, extremely show me the numbers. And yeah, if you're doing any kind of theory of change, where in what direction's the arrow pointing, you get back to the sort of schema of here's a lever and there's a switch. And I mean, of course, the world doesn't work like that. I've kind of went down a bit of a thread, Marius. I guess the one thing I'm able to talk about a little bit, and I see our time's also short, is the actual methodology, which is a combination of using the seeds and pretending that they mature. So using these weak signals, these pockets of the future, these good things where we can see little solutions, pretending they mature, mixing them up together, and in an inductive way, building scenario stories from that. And that's what you see if you click on the link that Johan put in second, that you're supposed to look at first. There's a lovely little whiteboard video on that link. It's just 4 minutes or something. Thanks, Johan. There's a lovely little whiteboard video which explains this way of working just superbly. And then after that, the resources, the academic papers and all the other things are available. And just to kind of, I guess, end off with this, once you've got these stories of how the future could be completely different and better and more hopeful, it's then a sort of a more standard, let's do 3 horizons to get a better understanding of systemic shifts. So we imagine we've got this completely different, good, hopeful 3rd horizon. We've got our seeds that aren't dominant, they're marginal, and then start having a conversation about how do they link? How does that desired future link to the present where we're seeing seeds? What could the possible pathways be? How could you connect these seeds? How could you scale them? What is it you need to do in the 1st horizon to help that 1st horizon decline? It's those kind of shifts, systemic shifts. And of course, the transition zone is in the middle. Boils down to what can we change? What are the things we need to do to change, to help systems shift? It's kind of the practicality. And I guess what's nice about the work, it's robust. It's now stood the test of time under many conditions. Marius, stop me.
Yeah, I want to come in
there.
We can, and I want to say that we deeply appreciate your enthusiasm and your generosity in sharing with us. I'm sure the participants will go and have a look at some of those resources. It is very relevant what you were sharing at the end around systems change, because of course we're not only interested in analyzing systems, we're interested in changing those systems if you're in the multilateral environment. So very powerful. It also links very nicely to what we cover next week, which is scenarios and causal node analysis, and how we use storytellings and 3 horizons to begin to understand the implications of our foresight work. So thank you very much. I want to say thank you from the side of the participants. Colleagues, let me confirm that we can connect you with Tanja if we need to, and we can certainly field your questions on House Space as we do. I see there's a last question from Chantel saying, what would you use to identify trends behind the news? We can't get into that now because of time. Unfortunately, we have a hard stop. But thank you again, Tanja, and we'll take those questions and comments through into House Space and address them there. And I hope, Tanja, that we see you again soon on a SWAF program or with this program. Have a lovely afternoon, and thank you, everyone, for a great session as always.
Okay, super. Enjoy. Yeah, have fun there.
Good to see you.
Bye.